Welcome to the deep dive. The Supreme Court just wrapped its term, and wow, they've delivered some rulings that could really shake things up. I mean, everything from how presidents govern to, what's taught in schools. We're seeing decisions with these like unexpected ripple effects, stuff that goes way beyond the main headlines. So today, our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the most significant ones. We're definitely focusing on that major case around birthright citizenship, and we want to look at what these rulings mean for you, how they might reshape the legal landscape, and, what surprising details pop out from the sources we've gathered, NBC News, U.S. News, places like that.
Absolutely. These end-of-term decisions are always a big deal, but this year, well, it feels particularly impactful. The headlines might zoom in on specific things like that birthright citizenship debate we mentioned. But the court's real focus, it seems, on judicial power, the scope of what lower courts can do, that has really far-reaching implications. It's not just about one topic. These decisions could fundamentally change how executive actions get challenged, how they're implemented really across the board.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We absolutely have to start with, well, probably the most closely watched case, President Trump's effort to restrict automatic birthright citizenship. Let's go back. His first day in office, right? He signs this executive order. And the aim was basically denying citizenship to children born in the U.S., but whose parents are here illegally or temporarily. And the response, almost immediate. Federal judges in Maryland, Washington, Massachusetts, they moved fast, blocked the order.
And this is where it gets, legally really interesting. Those judges blocked it because they looked at it and determined it likely violated the 14th Amendment,
Right.
Specifically the Citizenship Clause.
The 14th Amendment.
Exactly. And the specific wording is crucial. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Now, for a very, very long time, that clause has been interpreted to mean pretty much anyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a citizen. The main exception has always been like children of foreign diplomats. So that long-standing interpretation, that history, is really vital context for understanding why those judges acted so quickly with those injunctions.
Okay, so here's a key point, and maybe a bit confusing one. The Supreme Court isn't actually ruling on whether Trump's original idea, the policy itself, is lawful. Is that right? Why is that distinction so important?
That's exactly right. And it's a nuance often lost in the headlines, honestly. The Supreme Court's focus in this birthright citizenship case isn't the policy itself, not directly anyway. The core issue, the real legal question they're tackling, is whether federal judges have the authority to issue these things called nationwide injunctions. These basically block policies like Trump's across the entire country while the legal challenges are still going on.
Nationwide injunctions. Okay.
Yeah, think of it like an order from just one judge, but it applies everywhere to everyone, not just the specific people in that particular lawsuit. And they've become, well, a really significant check on presidential actions, particularly in recent years.
A significant check. How significant are we talking?
Well, get this. Judges issued something like 40 of these nationwide injunctions against the previous administration's executive actions just since the start of his second term.
40. Wow,
Yeah.
that's a huge number.
It really is an unprecedented number, and it definitely highlights the friction between the executive and judicial branches. So the administration, their goal here is to limit these injunctions. They want them to apply only to these specific plaintiffs involved in the case, not, the whole country.
Okay, 40. That really puts the power of these things in perspective. I can see why an administration would want to limit that, avoid those kinds of blanket blocks. But what's the argument for them? Why are they seen as like a necessary tool?
Well, the proponents, the people who support them, argue that they're often the only practical way to stop widespread harm from a government policy that might be unlawful, especially when that policy affects huge numbers of people or many different states at once. I mean, imagine a policy impacting millions. If you had to wait for individual lawsuits in every single district, it could take years. And in that time, irreparable harm could be done. So it's sort of like one judge, maybe sitting thousands of miles from D.C., can hit this giant pause button on a presidential directive for the whole nation.
A giant pause button.
Yeah, it's immense power when you think about it.
Yeah.
But it's also seen by many as, like, a vital safeguard against potential government overreach.
Okay, so let's picture the scene. The Supreme Court, oral arguments for this case. How did the justices grapple with this incredibly powerful tool? Our sources say the justices seemed, well, pretty skeptical about just letting Trump's original policy take effect while all the lawsuits play out. They really dug into whether nationwide injunctions are always the right tool, especially when it's states bringing the lawsuits. And they apparently explored other legal routes too, things like class actions, maybe. Could those achieve something similar without being a full nationwide block?
Right. And connecting this back to the bigger picture, the potential outcomes here, specifically on the injunctions, are really significant. They matter a lot. The court could decide to uphold the authority of lower courts to issue these nationwide injunctions. If they do that, it basically keeps Trump's policy on hold while the challenges continue. Or alternatively, they could limit the use of nationwide injunctions, maybe restrict when or how they can be used. And that could potentially make it easier for future administrations, any administration, to implement executive actions without facing these immediate broad blocks. Now, most indications, sort of reading the tea leaves from the arguments, suggest the court might try to avoid ruling on the underlying constitutional question about birthright citizenship itself, at least for now.
So kicking that can down the road, maybe.
Possibly. But the key thing here, the really fascinating part, is that any ruling that restricts nationwide injunctions could have these huge, far-reaching effects. It could really shift how presidential policies are challenged in the courts, potentially changing that delicate balance of power between the executive branch and the judiciary for years to come.
That focus on the injunctions, that deep dive there, it really clarifies the court's role in this specific case. It's not always what you think from the headlines. But the court, they tackled so much more as the term ended. What other rulings really stood out to you? What else should listeners be paying attention to?
Oh, absolutely. While the injunctions case got a lot of attention, several other decisions have pretty profound implications.
Yeah.
Take the case on preventive care mandates under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare.
Right, the ACA.
Yeah. This wasn't just about, healthcare policy details. It touched on the reach of federal mandates. It could directly impact millions of Americans getting access to things like cancer screenings or HIV prevention without copays. And the court basically upheld the ability to provide those services without cost sharing, which, public health advocates see as a major victory.
Okay, so that affects a lot of people directly.
Definitely. And then maybe less sweeping in national scope, but deeply felt in communities was that Maryland case.
Yeah.
The one about parents wanting to opt their kids out of classes featuring LGBT-themed storybooks.
Ah, yes. That's been a hot topic.
Exactly. And that ruling, or rather the court's decision not to take up the appeal, digs right into that tension between parental rights and public school curricula. It's a conflict playing out everywhere. By not intervening, the court effectively left the lower court's decision standing, which upheld the school district's policy. It kind of shows how the court picks its battles and how sometimes not deciding something can still have a really significant impact locally.
Interesting. Two very different cases, healthcare mandates and local school policies, but yeah, both clearly impactful. And beyond those, didn't they also look at voting rights stuff in Louisiana electoral districts?
Yes, that was on the docket.
And something about the FCC expanding broadband access?
The legality of their funding plan for that.
And even age verification for adult content online. So yeah,
Right.
A really wide-ranging set of issues.
It really was. And I think that sort of summarized the overarching theme, if there is one. The court's decisions this term, especially the ones touching on birthright citizenship and those nationwide injunctions, they really have the potential to reshape that balance of power we talked about between the executive branch and the courts. And that impacts immigration, sure, but also healthcare, education, really the fabric of public life. These rulings, when you look closely, they offer this kind of masterclass in how our different branches of government interact. And, knowledge is valuable, but it's most valuable when you understand it and see how it applies.
So, thinking about all this, what does it mean for your understanding for how you see a policy actually getting made and challenged in the U.S.? It's not always straightforward, is it? As you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider how these checks and balances, these tools like nationwide injunctions, how they act as these really dynamic controls on executive power. What might a future look like if those checks are, say, strengthened? Or maybe significantly weakened? And how could that ultimately shape the policies that affect your daily life and, well, the balance of power in our whole democracy? Something to think about.